The auction block had never been meant for her. But there Odessa Grant stood anyway, fourth in line behind three prettier girls while the ranch foreman's eyes skipped right past her like she was part of the wooden planks beneath her feet. It was 1874, and Moab, Utah was barely more than a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled against the Red Rock canyons, but it had enough men starved for companionship to make a mail-order bride auction profitable. Odessa had not come as a bride. She had come as a seamstress, hired by the town's general store to mend clothes and sew curtains. But when the wagon train arrived and she climbed down with road dust in her hair and exhaustion carved into her 22-year-old face, the organizer had taken one look at her traveling papers and laughed. Seamstress position was filled 2 months back, he had said, tobacco staining his teeth brown. But we got another opportunity if you are interested. She was not interested, but she also had 17 cents to her name and nowhere else to go. Now she stood on this platform in a borrowed dress that did not quite fit, watching men bid on women like they were cattle, and felt the familiar weight of being overlooked settle across her shoulders like an old shawl. The first girl went for $60. The second for $75. The third, a blonde with dimples, went for nearly $100, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Then it was Odessa's turn. She stepped forward, keeping her chin up even though her hands trembled. She had mousy brown hair that refused to curl no matter how she tortured it. Her eyes were an unremarkable gray. Her figure was too thin, her shoulders too broad from years of hauling water for her mother's boarding house back in Missouri. She had never been chosen first for anything. Not for dances, not for church socials, not even for teams when the neighborhood children played games in the street. The auctioneer started talking, listing her qualities like he was selling a plow horse. Healthy, can read and write, knows her way around a needle. The crowd was silent. Odessa felt heat crawl up her neck. A few men in the back were already turning away, heading toward the saloon. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the starting bid. Still nothing. She was about to step down, humiliation burning through her chest, when a voice cut through the afternoon air like a rifle crack. $500. The entire crowd turned. Odessa turned too, squinting against the sun to see who had spoken. He stood at the very back of the gathering, a man so tall and broad-shouldered that he seemed to block out the sky behind him. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord. His beard was thick, but trimmed close enough to see the sharp line of his jaw. He wore buckskin and fur despite the Utah heat, and even from a distance, Odessa could see the muscles that corded his forearms where his sleeves were rolled back. A mountain man. The kind of person who lived up in the high country and came to town maybe twice a year for supplies. 500, he repeated, his voice deep and certain. He did not look at any of the other women. He looked only at Odessa. The auctioneer nearly choked. Sir, the bidding starts at 20. I know what I said. The mountain man stepped forward through the crowd, which parted for him like water around a stone. Up close, he was even more imposing. He had to be 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that looked like they could carry a full-grown elk without strain. His eyes were a startling blue-green, the color of deep water, and they were fixed on Odessa with an intensity that made her breath catch. Anyone else? The auctioneer asked weakly, looking around at the other men. A few looked like they might have been interested before, but none of them were going to bid against this giant who had just offered more than a month's wages. The gavel came down. Sold to Mr. Sullivan Frost. Odessa's knees went weak. Sullivan Frost walked up to the platform and held out a hand to help her down. His palm was calloused and warm, and his fingers were so large that they engulfed her entire hand. You did not have to do that, she whispered as her feet touched solid ground. "I know," he said simply. He turned to the auctioneer and counted out $500 in gold coins and worn bills, a fortune that made the other man's eyes go wide. Then he looked back at Odessa. "You got belongings, just a trunk, at the staging house," he nodded. "We will get it." The crowd was staring. Odessa could feel their eyes on her back, hear the whispers starting. The mountain man did not seem to notice or care. He kept one hand lightly on her elbow as he guided her through the press of people, protective without being possessive. At the staging house, he lifted her trunk like it weighed nothing and secured it to the back of the largest horse Odessa had ever seen. A bay stallion with a chest like a barrel and hooves the size of dinner plates. There was a second horse beside it, a smaller mare with kind eyes. "That one is for you," Sullivan said, nodding toward the mare. "She is gentle, name is Pepper." Odessa stared at him. "You brought a horse for me, figured you would need one." He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like he had planned this. "How did you know I would be here?" Sullivan secured the last strap on her trunk and turned to face her fully. In the slanting afternoon light, his eyes were more green than blue. "I did not. But I have been coming to these auctions for 3 years, hoping." He paused, then added quietly, "I saw you step up on that platform and I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were the one I had been waiting for." Odessa had been proposed to exactly once before by a shop clerk back home who had been drunk and looking for someone to cook his meals. This was nothing like that. This was a man who had just spent $500 and 3 years of hoping on a woman he had never met. "You do not know anything about me," she said, but her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be. "I know you are brave enough to stand on that platform even though you were scared. I know you did not cry when nobody bid, even though you wanted to." Sullivan took a step closer. He smelled like pine and wood smoke and clean air. "I know that when I saw you, something in my chest went quiet for the first time in years. Like I had been carrying around a question I did not know how to ask, and you were the answer." Odessa did not know what to say to that. She had spent 22 years being passed over, ignored, forgotten. And now this man, this mountain of a man, was looking at her like she was the only person in the entire Utah territory. "I have a cabin up in the La Salle Mountains," Sullivan continued. "It is a half-day's ride from here. I trap and hunt, trade furs in the winter. It is a good life, but it is lonely." He paused, and for the first time she saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "I would like you to share it with me, as my wife if you are willing. But if you are not, I will take you wherever you want to go. You are not obligated to me just because I paid money. You are not property." "Then why did you bid?" "Because otherwise, someone else would have. And I could not stand the thought of you going to a man who did not see you the way I do." "And how do you see me?" Sullivan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle despite the size of his hands. "Like you are the first sunrise after a long winter, like you are everything I did not know I needed." Odessa felt tears prick her eyes. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. Nobody had ever looked at her like this. "You chose me first," she whispered. "I chose you first," he agreed. "And I will choose you last, and always in between." The minister was found in the town's only church, a small building with a crooked steeple and windows that did not quite fit their frames. He was an old man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose, but he was happy enough to perform a wedding ceremony for $2 and the promise that they would name their first child after him, if it was a boy. Odessa stood in the church as the sun set outside, turning the red rocks into flame, and married a man she had known for less than 2 hours. Sullivan's hands were steady when he slid a silver ring onto her finger, a simple band that he said had been his mother's. Her hands shook when she repeated the vows, but her voice did not waver. When the minister told Sullivan he could kiss his bride, the mountain man cupped Odessa's face in both hands like she was something precious and pressed his lips to hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache. It was not a passionate kiss, not yet. It was a promise. They rode out of Moab as the stars were beginning to appear. Sullivan led the way on his massive bay, and Odessa followed on Pepper, her trunk secured between them on a pack mule Sullivan had retrieved from the livery. The trail climbed steadily into the mountains, following a path that only someone who knew this country could find in the dark. Odessa was exhausted. She had been traveling for weeks, and the emotional weight of the day sat heavy on her shoulders. But Sullivan seemed to sense this. Every so often he would slow his horse and look back to check on her, his expression concerned. "We can stop if you need to rest," he offered when they had been riding for an hour. "How much farther?" "Another 3 hours. But there is a place up ahead with water and grass. We can camp there if you are tired." Odessa thought about it. Part of her wanted to keep going to see this cabin that was now supposedly her home, but a larger part of her was swaying in the saddle. "I think I need to stop." Sullivan nodded and guided them off the trail to a small clearing where a spring burbled out of the rocks. He helped Odessa down from her horse, and she was mortified to find that her legs nearly gave out. He caught her easily, steadying her until she found her balance. "Sorry," she mumbled. "I am not used to riding." "You will be," he said, not unkindly. "Come on. Sit down before you fall down." He made camp with the efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Within minutes he had a fire going and Odessa's bedroll spread out on a flat piece of ground. He made coffee in a battered pot and offered her jerky and hardtack, apologizing for the simple fare. "I have better food at the cabin," he said. "Smoked venison, potatoes, preserves. My sister brings me things sometimes." "You have a sister," Sullivan nodded. "Sarah. She is married to a rancher down in the valley, has 3 kids." He poked at the fire with a stick. "She has been after me to find a wife for years, said I was going to turn into a hermit if I was not careful." "Were you turning into a hermit?" He smiled a little, the firelight catching in his eyes. "Maybe. I like the mountains, I like the quiet, but I do not like being alone." He looked at her across the flames. "I am glad you are here, Odessa." Hearing her name in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. "I am glad too," she said, and realized she meant it. This was insane. She had married a stranger and was riding into the mountains to live in a cabin she had never seen. But somehow, sitting here by the fire with this gentle giant of a man, she felt safer than she had in years. "Can I ask you something?" Sullivan said after a moment. "Of course." "Why were you at that auction? You do not seem like the kind of woman who would choose that." Odessa wrapped her arms around her knees. "I did not choose it. I was supposed to be a seamstress, but the position was filled and I had nowhere else to go, no money to get back home. The organizer suggested the auction and I was desperate enough to agree." She stared into the fire. "I have never been anyone's first choice, not for anything. I thought maybe out here, where there are fewer women, someone might want me, even if it was just because there were no other options." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked around the fire to sit beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was warm and solid. "That man on the platform," he said quietly, "the one who was running the auction, he was a fool, and so was every man who looked at you and looked away." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "You are not a last resort, Odessa. You are not a consolation prize. You are the woman I have been searching for, and I would have paid twice as much if I had to, 3 times. Everything I had. You do not even know me. I know enough." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. And I want to know more. I want to know everything. What you like for breakfast, what makes you laugh, what you dream about when you sleep." His voice went softer. "I want to spend the rest of my life learning you." Odessa felt tears slip down her cheeks. She could not help it. For 22 years she had been invisible. And now this man, this beautiful, impossible man, was seeing her so clearly it hurt. Sullivan wiped away her tears with his thumbs, his touch feather light. "Did I say something wrong?" "No," she whispered. "You said everything right." He smiled then, a real smile that showed teeth and crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Good, because I meant every word." They sat together by the fire as the night deepened around them. Sullivan told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands and the land he had claimed. He told her about the winters when the snow got so deep he could not leave for weeks at a time, and the springs when the wildflowers covered the meadows like a quilt. He told her about the animals he had seen, the bears and elk and mountain lions, and the time he had pulled a wolf cub out of a trap and nursed it back to health. Odessa told him about Missouri, about her mother's boarding house and the endless stream of guests who needed feeding and tending. She told him about her father, who had died when she was 12, and her younger brother who had gone west to pan for gold and never come back. She told him about the loneliness of being ordinary in a world that seemed to prize the extraordinary. "You are not ordinary," Sullivan said firmly. "Do not ever think that." When the fire burned low, Sullivan spread out his own bedroll a respectful distance from hers. "Sleep," he said gently. "We have a long ride tomorrow and you need rest." Odessa lay down and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Above her, the stars were so thick and bright they looked like someone had spilled salt across black velvet. She could hear Sullivan's breathing, slow and steady, and the occasional pop of the dying fire. "Sullivan," she said into the darkness. "Yes, thank you for choosing me." There was a pause, and then his voice came back, warm and certain. "Always, Odessa, always." She fell asleep with a smile on her face. They reached the cabin the next afternoon, after hours of climbing through pine forests and across high meadows that were still dotted with late summer wildflowers. Odessa was sore and exhausted, but when the cabin came into view, she sat up straighter in her saddle. It was beautiful. Not fancy, but solid and well-made, built from logs that had been carefully fitted and chinked. It sat in a clearing with a view down the valley that seemed to stretch forever, all red rocks and blue sky. There was a barn beside it, and a small corral with a few goats and a garden plot that looked well tended. "You built this yourself?" Odessa asked as Sullivan helped her down from Pepper. "Most of it. My brother-in-law helped with the barn." He looked at the cabin with something like pride. "It is not much, but it is tight and warm, and the view is good." "It is perfect," Odessa said honestly. Sullivan smiled and took her hand. "Come on, I will show you inside." The interior was one large room with a sleeping loft above. There was a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies and books, and a bed in the corner that looked like it had been built for someone Sullivan's size. Everything was neat and clean, which surprised Odessa. She had expected a bachelor's mess. "I have been trying to get it ready," Sullivan admitted, watching her look around. "I did not know when I would bring a wife home, but I wanted it to be nice when I did. You really have been planning this for 3 years." He set her trunk down near the bed. "I know it is not what you are used to. It is better," Odessa said. She ran her hand over the smooth wood of the table. "Back home, I shared a room with 2 other girls. I have never had space of my own. Well, now you have all of this." Sullivan spread his arms to encompass the cabin. "And me if you want me." Odessa turned to look at him. He stood there in the afternoon light streaming through the windows, big and solid and real, and she felt something shift in her chest. This was her husband. This was her home. And for the first time in her life, she had been chosen first. "I want you," she said quietly. The heat that flared in Sullivan's eyes made her breath catch. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that had been restrained the night before. Odessa kissed him back, standing on her toes to reach him, her hands fisting in his shirt. He was all hard muscle and warmth, and when he picked her up like she weighed nothing and carried her to the bed, she did not protest. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows when they finally lay tangled together, Odessa's head on Sullivan's broad chest and his arms wrapped around her. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady beneath her ear. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rumbling through his chest. "Better than all right." She pressed a kiss to his skin. "I did not know it could be like that." Sullivan's arms tightened around her. "It is like that when you care about the person, when you choose them. First and last and always in between," Odessa murmured, remembering his words. "Exactly." They dozed for a while, wrapped in each other in the warm afternoon light. When they finally got up, Sullivan made dinner while Odessa unpacked her trunk. She did not have much. A few dresses, some undergarments, a book of poetry her mother had given her, and her sewing supplies. Sullivan made venison stew with potatoes and carrots from his garden, and it was the best thing Odessa had tasted in weeks. They ate at the table while he told her about the rhythms of life in the mountains, how he would trap in the winter and hunt in the fall, how he grew vegetables in the short summer and preserved what he could for the lean months. "I will teach you everything," he promised. "How to shoot, how to track, how to read the weather. You will need to know it all if you are going to live up here." "I want to learn," Odessa said. And she did. She wanted to be useful, to be a partner in this life they were building together. Over the next weeks, Sullivan was true to his word. He taught her how to handle a rifle, standing behind her to steady her aim and murmuring encouragement in her ear. He taught her how to skin and dress a deer without wasting any of the meat. He showed her which plants were edible and which were poison, which tracks belonged to elk and which to bear. Odessa soaked it all in like a sponge. She had never been allowed to learn things like this back home. Women were supposed to stay inside and tend to domestic matters. But up here, with Sullivan, she could be capable in ways she had never imagined. She also learned about him. She learned that he was 30 years old and had come west after his parents died, looking for a fresh start. She learned that he was patient and kind, quick to laugh and slow to anger. She learned that he read poetry in the evenings and could play the harmonica well enough to make her cry with the beauty of it. She learned that he talked to the horses and the goats like they were people, and that he had a soft spot for injured animals. And she learned that he loved her. He showed it in 100 small ways. The way he made sure she had the warmest blanket at night. The way he brought her wildflowers when he came back from checking his traps. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, like her words mattered. The way he touched her, with reverence and desire all mixed together. One morning, about a month after they had arrived at the cabin, Odessa woke to find Sullivan already up and making breakfast. She climbed down from the loft where they now slept together and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against his broad back. "Good morning," she murmured. He turned in her arms and kissed her forehead. "Good morning, wife. Sleep well, always when I am with you." They ate breakfast together as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Odessa felt a contentment she had never known before, a sense of belonging that went bone deep. "I need to go into town today," Sullivan said as he cleared the dishes. "To trade some furs and get supplies for the winter. Want to come with me?" Odessa hesitated. Part of her wanted to go, to see other people and get news of the world beyond their mountain. But another part of her dreaded facing the town, the people who had watched her stand on that auction block. Sullivan seemed to sense her reluctance. He sat back down and took her hand. "You do not have to come if you do not want to, but I would like to have you with me. I want people to see us together, to see that you are my wife and that I am proud of it." The uncertainty in Odessa's chest melted away. "All right," she said. "I will come." They rode down to Moab together, taking their time and enjoying the journey. When they arrived in the late afternoon, Odessa was surprised by how different the town looked now. It was not the place of her humiliation anymore. It was just a small settlement trying to survive in harsh country. Sullivan kept her close as they walked through the streets, his hand on the small of her back. People stared, but he ignored them. He took her to the general store and let her pick out fabric for new dresses, buttons and thread, a pair of proper boots. He bought her a hat to keep the sun off her face and a warm coat for the coming winter. At the mercantile, they ran into the auctioneer, the man who had tried so hard to sell Odessa off. He looked uncomfortable when he saw them, but Sullivan just nodded politely and moved on. "You ever regret it?" Odessa asked when they were outside again. "Paying so much for me?" Sullivan stopped walking and turned to face her, right there in the middle of the dusty street. "I have never regretted a single second of knowing you, Odessa Frost. Not one." He cupped her face in his hands, oblivious to the people watching. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. I would pay that $500 every day for the rest of my life if I had to." Odessa felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. She stood on her toes and kissed him, not caring who saw. When she pulled back, Sullivan was smiling. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "Let us get the rest of the supplies and go home." Home. The word settled warm in Odessa's chest. The cabin in the mountains was home now, and Sullivan was her family. They were loading the last of the supplies onto the pack mule when a woman approached them. She was young and pretty, with dark hair and a baby on her hip and two small children clinging to her skirts. "Sully," she called out, waving. Sullivan's face lit up. "Sarah." He hurried over and swept the woman into a one-armed hug, careful of the baby. "What are you doing in town?" "Same as you, I expect, getting supplies." Sarah looked past him to Odessa, her eyes bright with curiosity. "And who is this?" "This is Odessa, my wife." There was no mistaking the pride in Sullivan's voice. "Odessa, this is my sister Sarah and her children. The baby is little Samuel, and these two are Margaret and John." Sarah's eyes went wide. "Your wife? Sully, when did this happen?" "About a month ago, at the auction." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face, followed by a wide smile. "Oh, Sully, finally." She shifted the baby to her other hip and reached out to shake Odessa's hand. "It is so wonderful to meet you. My brother has been talking about finding a wife for years, but I was starting to think he never would." "He found me," Odessa said, smiling. "Or I found him. I am not sure which." "Both," Sullivan said firmly. He put his arm around Odessa's shoulders. "We found each other." Sarah invited them to dinner, but Sullivan declined, explaining that they needed to get back to the cabin before dark. But he promised to bring Odessa down to the ranch soon for a proper visit. On the ride back up the mountain, Odessa found herself smiling. She had a sister now, nieces and nephews, a family that was growing instead of shrinking. "You are happy," Sullivan observed as they rode. "I am," Odessa said. "Happier than I have ever been. Good." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "That is all I want, to keep you happy." "You do," she assured him. "Every single day." The first snow came in late October, earlier than Sullivan had expected. Odessa woke to find the world outside transformed, everything covered in a pristine blanket of white. She pressed her face to the cold window and watched fat flakes drift down from a gray sky. "Beautiful, is it not?" Sullivan said from behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on top of her head. I have never seen so much snow. This is just the start. By January, it will be up to the windows. He kissed her temple. But we are ready. We have enough wood and food to last through spring if we need to. And they did. Sullivan had spent the fall hunting and preserving meat, harvesting the last of the garden and chopping enough firewood to heat a city. The cabin was stocked and secure, a warm haven against the coming winter. Odessa discovered that she loved the snow. She loved the quiet it brought, the way it muffled sound and made the world feel smaller and more intimate. She loved sitting by the fire with Sullivan in the evenings, reading or sewing while he carved small figures from wood or played his harmonica. She especially loved the nights, when they would burrow under the quilts together, and Sullivan would pull her against his chest, his body heat keeping her warm even when the wind howled outside. In December, Sullivan went out to check his traps and came back with more than furs. He had a worried look on his face that immediately put Odessa on alert. "What is wrong?" she asked as he stamped snow off his boots. "There is a storm coming, a big one. I could feel it in the air." He hung up his coat and came to warm his hands by the fire. "We need to make sure everything is secure. The animals are fed and watered, the wood is stacked close to the cabin. We might be stuck inside for days." They spent the afternoon preparing, bringing in extra wood and water, checking the shutters and the door. Sullivan brought the goats into the barn and made sure the horses had plenty of hay. By the time they finished, the wind was already picking up, and the snow was starting to fall in earnest. The storm hit that night like a living thing. The wind screamed around the cabin, and the snow fell so thick and fast that Odessa could not see more than a few feet beyond the windows. She huddled close to Sullivan by the fire, trying not to show how nervous she was. "It is all right," he murmured, pulling her into his lap. "The cabin has weathered worse. We are safe here." The storm lasted 3 days. For 3 days, the world outside was nothing but white fury. Odessa and Sullivan stayed inside, keeping the fire going and rationing their supplies carefully. They played cards and told stories and made love while the wind tried to tear the roof off. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Odessa woke to silence and brilliant sunshine. She climbed out of bed and went to the window, gasping at what she saw. The snow was halfway up the door, and everything was buried under drifts that looked like frozen waves. "We are going to have to dig out," Sullivan said, coming to stand beside her. But he did not sound worried. If anything, he sounded pleased. "Gives me an excuse to stay close to you for a few more days." It took them a week to dig out from the storm. Sullivan did most of the heavy work, shoveling paths to the barn and the woodpile, but Odessa helped where she could. They worked together, a team, and by the time they were done, Odessa's muscles ached, but she felt strong, capable. Winter deepened. January came and went in a blur of snow and cold and long nights by the fire. February brought slightly longer days, but no relief from the weather. Odessa learned to bake bread in the Dutch oven and to make stews that would stretch for days. She learned to knit socks and mend the holes in Sullivan's shirts. She learned the patience required to wait out a winter in the mountains, and through it all, Sullivan was there. Steady and strong and unfailingly kind. He never complained about the isolation or the cold. He seemed content just to be with her, to share this small space and their quiet life. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Sullivan set down the piece of wood he was carving and turned to Odessa. "I have something I want to tell you," he said. Odessa looked up from her sewing. "What is it?" "I love you." The words were simple, but the emotion behind them was not. "I have loved you since the moment I saw you on that platform, but I wanted to wait to say it until I knew you felt the same way, or until I could not wait anymore." He reached out and took her hand. I love you, Odessa. More than I thought it was possible to love another person. Odessa felt her eyes fill with tears. She set down her sewing and climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. I love you too, she whispered against his ear. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I did not know I could feel this way. Sullivan pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes searching her face. You mean it? Every word. She kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude and wonder into it. When she finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. You chose me first, Sullivan, and I choose you, every day, for the rest of my life. They made love there by the fire, slow and sweet and full of whispered promises. And afterwards, as they lay tangled together under a blanket, Odessa felt a peace settle over her that went deeper than anything she had known before. She was loved. She was chosen. She was home. Spring came to the mountains in a rush of melting snow and budding trees. The meadows turned green overnight, and the wildflowers began to bloom in riots of color. Sullivan took Odessa on long walks to show her how the land transformed, pointing out the first shoots of new grass and the tracks of animals emerging from their winter dens. In April, they rode down to visit Sarah and her family at the ranch. Odessa had been nervous about the visit, worried that she would not fit in or that Sullivan's family would not accept her. But Sarah welcomed her with open arms, insisting that she stay for several days and treating her like the sister she had never had. The ranch was bustling and noisy, full of children and animals, and the constant work of keeping everything running. Odessa helped Sarah with the cooking and the washing, and in the evenings, they would sit on the porch while the men talked and the children played. I am so glad Sully found you, Sarah said one evening as they watched the sunset. He was so lonely up in those mountains by himself. I worried about him. He does not seem lonely now, Odessa said. No, he does not, Sarah smiled. He seems happy, happier than I have ever seen him. You are good for him, Odessa. He is good for me too. Odessa hesitated, then asked, did he really come to those auctions for 3 years? Sarah nodded. Every time one was held, he would ride down from the mountains and watch, hoping to find someone who felt right, but it never happened. Until you. She reached over and squeezed Odessa's hand. I think he was waiting for you specifically, like somehow he knew you were out there. The thought made Odessa's chest ache in the best way. I am glad he waited. I cannot imagine belonging to anyone else. When they left the ranch a few days later, Odessa felt even more connected to this new life. She had a family now, people who cared about her, a place in the world. Summer in the mountains was glorious. The days were long and warm, and Odessa spent them helping Sullivan tend the garden and repair the cabin and prepare for the next winter. She learned to fish in the cold mountain streams and to identify the calls of different birds. She learned to ride Pepper well enough that she and Sullivan could go on long trips through the high country, camping under the stars and exploring the wild places that few people ever saw. It was on one of those trips, in a meadow so high that the air was thin and the sky looked close enough to touch, that Odessa realized she might be pregnant. Her courses had not come in 2 months, and she had been feeling queasy in the mornings. She had not said anything to Sullivan yet, not wanting to get his hopes up in case she was wrong. But sitting there in that meadow with wildflowers all around and Sullivan sketching the view in a small journal he kept, she felt a certainty settle over her. Sullivan, she said quietly. He looked up, his expression immediately concerned. What is wrong? Nothing is wrong. She took a breath. I think I am with child. The journal slipped from his fingers. For a moment he just stared at her, his eyes wide. Then a smile spread across his face, so bright and joyful that it took her breath away. Really? He asked, his voice cracking a little. I think so. I am not certain, but all the signs are there." Sullivan crossed the meadow in 3 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her, his big hands settling gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." Odessa ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Are you happy?" "Happy." He looked up at her and there were tears in his eyes. "Odessa, I am more than happy, I am blessed. We are going to have a family." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, and Odessa felt the future unfold before them like a map. A child, maybe more than one. A life filled with love and laughter and the endless beauty of these mountains. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "First and last and always in between," he whispered back. They rode back to the cabin the next day, and Sullivan immediately became the most protective husband in the world. He would not let Odessa lift anything heavy or climb the ladder to the loft or do any of the harder chores. She protested, laughing, that she was not made of glass. "I know," he said, his hand resting on her stomach, "but you are carrying something precious. I am not taking any chances." As summer turned to fall, Odessa's belly began to swell. Sullivan would spend hours with his hand on her stomach, waiting to feel the baby move. When he finally felt that first flutter, his face lit up like Christmas morning. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "I feel it all the time," Odessa said, smiling. "The baby is very active, good, strong like their mother." They made preparations for the baby's arrival. Sullivan built a cradle from smooth pine and carved little animals on the sides. Odessa sewed tiny gowns and blankets, her hands moving with a skill born from years of practice. Sarah visited in October and brought gifts, more baby clothes, a soft shawl, advice about childbirth that made Odessa both more prepared and more nervous. "You will do fine," Sarah assured her. "And Sully will be right there with you. He will not leave your side." "I know," Odessa said. And she did. Sullivan would never leave her. He had chosen her first, and he would be there until the end. The baby came in early December, just as the first serious snow of the season was falling. Odessa's labor started in the morning, and by afternoon, the pains were coming hard and fast. Sullivan sent one of the goats running down the mountain with a message tied to its collar, a trick Sarah had taught him, but he knew the midwife would not make it in time. "It is all right," he told Odessa as she gripped his hand through another contraction. "I have helped birth foals and calves. We can do this." Odessa would have laughed if she had the breath. Leave it to Sullivan to compare her to livestock at a time like this, but his calm steadiness helped. He stayed with her, coaching her through the pains, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, telling her how strong she was and how proud he was of her. The baby was born just as the sun was setting, a boy with dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. Sullivan caught him and wrapped him in a clean blanket, his hands shaking as he placed the baby on Odessa's chest. "A son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a son, Odessa." Odessa looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature in her arms and felt love slam into her with the force of an avalanche. "He is perfect," she whispered. Sullivan kissed her forehead, then the baby's. "You are both perfect." They named him Samuel, after Sarah's baby, with a middle name of Thomas after Sullivan's father. Little Samuel Frost was a healthy, hungry baby who seemed determined to make his presence known. Sullivan was besotted from the start, carrying the baby around the cabin and talking to him in a low, soothing voice about the mountains and the animals, and all the things they would do together when he was older. Odessa watched her husband with their son and felt her heart expand. This was her family, the one she had never thought she would have, the one Sullivan had given her when he chose her first. Winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and baby smiles. Samuel grew quickly, thriving in the mountain air. By spring, he was sitting up on his own and reaching for everything. By summer, he was crawling, and Sullivan had to build a gate to keep him away from the fireplace. Sarah visited often, bringing her own children to play with Samuel and offering Odessa advice and companionship. Odessa was grateful for the friendship. Living in the mountains was beautiful, but it could be isolating, especially with a baby. One afternoon in late summer, when Samuel was about 9 months old, Odessa was working in the garden while the baby napped in the cabin. She heard Sullivan shout and looked up to see him running toward her from the tree line, his rifle in his hands. "Get inside," he yelled. "Bear!" Odessa did not hesitate. She dropped her basket and ran for the cabin, her heart pounding. She could hear crashing in the trees behind her, something big moving fast. She made it through the door and slammed it shut just as Sullivan reached the porch. He turned, putting himself between the cabin and the bear, his rifle raised. The bear, a massive black creature with a torn ear, stopped at the edge of the clearing and rose up on its hind legs, roaring. Sullivan fired a shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing off the mountains. The bear dropped back to all fours and swayed, considering. Sullivan fired again, this time into the ground near the bear's feet. That was enough. The bear turned and lumbered back into the trees, disappearing into the forest. Sullivan waited a long moment, making sure the bear was really gone, before he lowered the rifle and came inside. His hands were shaking. "Are you all right?" Odessa asked, rushing to him. "I am fine. Are you? Is Samuel?" "We are both fine." She checked on the baby, who had slept through the whole thing, then turned back to her husband. That was terrifying. Sullivan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I know, but you are safe. That is all that matters." Odessa pressed her face against his chest, breathing in his familiar scent. "You put yourself between us and that bear without even thinking about it." "Of course I did. You are my family." "I will always protect you." He kissed the top of her head. "First and last and always in between, remember." "I remember," she whispered. The seasons turned. Samuel grew into a toddler, curious and energetic and fearless in the way that only children can be. Sullivan taught him to walk by holding his hands and letting him toddle around the cabin, laughing with delight every time the boy took a step on his own. Odessa watched them together and marveled at the life they had built. She thought about the woman she had been, standing on that auction block in Moab, certain that nobody would want her. And then she thought about the life she had now, full of love and laughter and purpose. She got pregnant again when Samuel was 2. This time, she was less surprised by the symptoms and more confident about what was happening. When she told Sullivan, he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing. "Another one," he said, his eyes bright. "We are going to need a bigger cabin." "Eventually," Odessa agreed, laughing too, "but not for a while yet." This pregnancy was easier than the first. Odessa knew what to expect, and her body seemed to handle it better. Sullivan was still protective, but he had learned that she was tougher than she looked and did not hover quite as much. Their daughter was born in the spring, during a thunderstorm that shook the mountains. She came quickly, as if impatient to join the world, and she had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair. They named her Clara, after Odessa's mother, who had passed away the year before Odessa had come west. Sullivan held his daughter with the same wonder he had shown with Samuel, his big hands cradling her tiny body with infinite care. "2 children," he said softly. "We are blessed, Odessa." "We are," she agreed, watching Samuel peer curiously at his new sister. "So very blessed." Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. The cabin was noisier and messier, but it was also fuller of joy. Samuel adored his little sister, always wanting to help take care of her. Clara was a happy baby who rarely cried and seemed content to watch the world with her solemn gray eyes. Sullivan expanded the cabin that summer, adding a second room where the children could sleep. He built bunk beds for when they got older and carved their names into the wood above each bed. He also built a larger table, knowing that their family might continue to grow. Odessa had never been happier. She had gone from being a woman nobody chose to being the center of a loving family. She was a wife, a mother, a partner in every sense of the word. And every day, Sullivan showed her that she was loved and valued and chosen. On their 5th anniversary, Sullivan took Odessa on a picnic to the meadow where she had told him she was pregnant with Samuel. The children were with Sarah for the day, giving them rare time alone together. They ate lunch sitting on a blanket surrounded by wildflowers, talking and laughing like they always did. After they finished eating, Sullivan reached into his pack and pulled out a small wooden box. "I made this for you," he said, handing it to her. Odessa opened the box to find a necklace, a delicate chain with a carved wooden pendant. The pendant showed 3 figures, a tall man, a woman, and 2 small children, all holding hands. "Our family," Sullivan said, "so you can carry us with you always." Odessa felt tears spill down her cheeks. "It is beautiful, Sullivan. Thank you." He fastened the necklace around her throat, his fingers gentle on her skin. "Thank you for choosing me back," he said quietly. "Thank you for building this life with me, for giving me a family, for being everything I needed before I even knew what that was." Odessa turned in his arms and kissed him, tasting salt from her tears and the sweetness of the berries they had eaten. "I would choose you 1,000 times over," she whispered. "You chose me first, but I choose you every single day." They lay together in the wildflowers as the afternoon sun warmed them, talking about the future. Maybe more children if they were blessed. Teaching Samuel and Clara about the mountains and the land. Growing old together in the cabin they had made a home. "I never imagined my life could be this good," Odessa said softly. "When I was standing on that auction block, I thought my life was over. I thought I would always be the woman nobody wanted." Sullivan pulled her closer. "You were never that woman. You were always the woman I wanted. The only woman. I just had to find you. And you did." "I did." He kissed her temple. "First and last and always in between." The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, with the same gentle nature and easy laugh. Clara grew into a bright, curious girl who loved books and flowers and helping her mother in the garden. Sullivan continued to trap and hunt, providing for his family with the same steady reliability he brought to everything he did. Odessa became known in the area as a skilled seamstress and healer. People would make the long journey up the mountain to have her mend their clothes or to ask for her help with illnesses and injuries. She never charged much, happy to use her skills to help others. When Samuel was 10 and Clara was 8, Odessa became pregnant again. This time, it was twins, 2 boys who arrived in the middle of winter and kept their parents up at all hours with their crying. Sullivan walked the floor with them, one baby in each arm, singing old songs his mother had taught him. They named the twins Peter and James, and they were identical in every way except temperament. Peter was quiet and serious, while James was loud and mischievous. Together they were a handful, but they brought even more love and laughter to the growing family. The cabin had to be expanded again. Sullivan added another room and built more beds, and the small clearing in the mountains rang with the sounds of children playing and growing. Odessa looked at her life, and could hardly believe it was real. She had 4 children, a husband who loved her beyond measure, and a home that was full of warmth and joy. She thought about the lonely girl she had been, the one who had never been chosen for anything, and she marveled at how far she had come. One evening, when the children were all asleep and she and Sullivan were sitting by the fire, she said, "You remember what you said to me the day we met, about choosing me first and last and always in between?" Sullivan looked up from the harness he was mending. "Of course I remember. I meant every word. I know you did, and you have proven it every single day since." She moved to sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I just want you to know that you changed my life, Sullivan. You gave me everything I never knew I needed: a home, a family, love." Sullivan set down the harness and wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "You gave me the same, Odessa. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions, but you made me come alive. You gave me a purpose, a reason to wake up happy every morning." He kissed her hair. "I chose you first because I saw something in you that nobody else seemed to see. But you chose me back, and that is what made all the difference." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the firelight dance and listening to the soft sounds of their children sleeping. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. This was their life. This was their love, built on a foundation of mutual choosing, strengthened by years of partnership and devotion, and blessed with the family they had created together. The children grew. Samuel became a skilled hunter and tracker, often going out with his father on long trips into the wilderness. Clara developed her mother's talent for sewing and her father's love of reading, and she dreamed of becoming a teacher someday. The twins, Peter and James, were inseparable and constantly getting into trouble, but they were good boys with kind hearts. When Samuel was 18, he started courting a girl from the valley, a sweet-faced rancher's daughter named Emily. Sullivan gave his blessing and his advice, telling his son to choose with his heart and to cherish the woman he chose. Odessa watched her son fall in love and felt her heart swell with pride. He was so much like his father, steady and strong and gentle. She knew he would make a good husband. Samuel and Emily were married in the spring, and Sullivan helped his son build a small cabin not far from their own. Odessa cried at the wedding, overwhelmed with emotion as she watched her firstborn start his own family. "Are you all right?" Sullivan asked, handing her a handkerchief. "I am more than all right," Odessa said, dabbing at her eyes. "I am just so happy. Our boy is grown and married, and we are going to be grandparents someday." Sullivan pulled her into his arms. "We did good, did we not, with our children?" "We did," Odessa agreed. "We did very good." True to her prediction, Samuel and Emily had their first child the following year, a baby girl they named Odessa after her grandmother. When Sullivan and Odessa went to visit and saw their granddaughter for the first time, Odessa wept again, this time with pure joy. "She has your eyes," Sullivan murmured, looking down at the baby. "And your chin," Odessa replied, tracing a finger over the baby's tiny face. Life continued to unfold with all its joys and sorrows. Sarah passed away when she was 60, and Odessa and Sullivan mourned the loss of a dear friend and sister. But new life continued to come into the world. Clara married a kind schoolteacher and moved to the valley, where she started her own school and had 3 children. The twins both became ranchers, working side by side the way they had always done everything. As the years passed, Sullivan's hair turned gray and his face became lined with age, but to Odessa, he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. His strength remained, though it was tempered now with the wisdom of years. He still checked his traps in the winter and hunted in the fall, and he still carried Odessa over puddles and up steep hills, insisting that he was not too old to take care of his wife. Odessa's hair turned silver, and her hands became gnarled with arthritis, but she still sewed and tended her garden and welcomed the endless stream of grandchildren who came to visit. She still wore the necklace Sullivan had made her, the one with the carved family, though she had added to it over the years with charms representing each new grandchild. On their 30th anniversary, they took a trip back to Moab. The town had grown considerably, with new buildings and more people, but the church where they had been married was still standing. They walked through the streets hand in hand, two old people who had spent a lifetime loving each other. When they passed the place where the auction platform had once stood, Odessa stopped. "I remember standing there," she said quietly, "thinking that my life was over before it had really begun, thinking that nobody would ever want me." Sullivan squeezed her hand. "And then I saw you, and I knew that everything I had been waiting for was standing right in front of me." Odessa looked up at her husband, at the man who had chosen her first and last and always in between. "You gave me the most beautiful life, Sullivan. Thank you." "No," he said, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "Thank you for saying yes, for building this life with me, for loving me as fiercely as I love you." He kissed her, soft and sweet. "You were always the one, Odessa. From the very beginning, you were always the one." They stayed in Moab for a few days, visiting old haunts and making new memories. On their last night, they attended a dance at the town hall. Sullivan led Odessa onto the floor and pulled her into his arms, moving with her to the music the way they had danced countless times before. "You know," Odessa said as they swayed together, "you chose me first that day at the auction, but I have chosen you first every day since, in every way that matters." Sullivan smiled down at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "First and last and always in between," he murmured. "First and last and always in between," she echoed. They danced until the music stopped, and then they danced a little longer, lost in each other and in the lifetime of love they had shared. They returned to the mountain cabin, to the home they had built together. The grandchildren visited often, filling the house with noise and laughter. Samuel's daughter, young Odessa, loved to sit with her grandmother and learn to sew. Clara's sons loved to go hunting with their grandfather, learning to track and shoot and respect the wilderness. Sullivan and Odessa grew old together in the mountains they loved. They sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the sun set over the red rocks. They held hands through church services and family dinners. They still kissed each other good night and good morning, cherishing every moment they had. When Sullivan was 70 and Odessa was 62, they welcomed their 12th grandchild into the world. They were sitting on the porch when they got the news, and Sullivan laughed with pure delight. 12 grandchildren," he said, shaking his head. "Can you believe it?" "I can," Odessa said, smiling. "We have built something good here, Sullivan, a legacy of love." "We have," he agreed. He took her hand and raised it to his lips. "And it all started because I saw a woman on an auction block and knew I would spend the rest of my life loving her." Odessa leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. She thought about all the years they had shared, all the moments big and small that had woven together to create their story. The laughter and the tears, the struggles and the triumphs, the quiet everyday moments that had been just as precious as the dramatic ones. She had been a woman nobody chose. And then Sullivan had chosen her, not just once but every single day. He had seen value in her when she could not see it in herself. He had loved her when she felt unlovable. He had given her a family, a home, a life beyond her wildest dreams, and she had given him the same. Because love, real love, was not about one person choosing another. It was about two people choosing each other, over and over again through all the seasons of life. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too," Sullivan replied. "First and last and always in between." They sat together as the stars came out. Two old people who had spent a lifetime proving that sometimes the best love stories start with the simplest choice. The choice to see someone when others look away. The choice to value someone when others dismiss them. The choice to love someone fully and completely for exactly who they are. Sullivan had chosen Odessa first, and she had chosen him back. And in that mutual choosing, they had built a love that would last through all their days and beyond. A love that their children and grandchildren would carry forward into the future. As the moon rose over the La Salle Mountains, casting silver light across the meadow, Odessa closed her eyes and smiled. She had never been chosen first for anything, until the day a mountain man saw her and knew. And from that day forward, she had been chosen first and last and always in between, loved beyond measure, treasured beyond price. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible. And it was everything. Years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of mountain life. Sullivan remained strong well into his 70s, still chopping wood and maintaining the cabin even as his children and grandchildren urged him to slow down. Odessa's garden continued to thrive under her careful tending, and she spent her days surrounded by family, teaching her granddaughters to sew and cook and tend to a household. They celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. The cabin could not hold everyone, so they gathered outside in the meadow, the same meadow where Sullivan had proposed so many decades before. There was food and music and laughter, and when Sullivan stood to make a toast, everyone fell silent. 40 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I paid $500 for the most precious thing I have ever owned. Not owned, he corrected himself, looking at Odessa with eyes full of love. Partnered with, loved, cherished. He raised his glass. To my wife, who has given me the most beautiful life a man could ask for, who has been my partner in all things, my comfort in hard times, my joy in good times, who chose me back when she could have walked away. Odessa stood and went to him, taking his hand. To my husband, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, who saw me when I was invisible, who chose me when nobody else would, who has loved me every single day for 40 years. She looked out at their family, at the legacy of love they had created. We have been blessed beyond measure. The family cheered and toasted, and then the music started again. Sullivan led Odessa into a slow dance, moving carefully on joints that were not as nimble as they once were, but with the same tenderness he had always shown her. 40 years, he murmured against her hair. And I would live it all again, exactly the same way. So would I, Odessa whispered back. Every single moment. Sullivan lived to be 76 years old. He passed away peacefully in his sleep one winter night with Odessa beside him as she had been for 44 years. She woke in the early morning to find him still and quiet, his hand still clasped in hers, a slight smile on his face. The grief was overwhelming. Odessa had known it would come someday, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of losing the man who had been her entire world. She wept as she had never wept before, surrounded by her children who had come as soon as they heard the news. They buried Sullivan on the mountain he had loved, in a spot overlooking the valley with a view that stretched forever. The whole community came to pay their respects to the mountain man who had lived with such integrity and loved so deeply. Odessa stood by the grave, supported by Samuel and Clara, and said her final goodbye to the man who had changed her life. "Thank you," she whispered as they lowered him into the earth. "Thank you for choosing me first." In the weeks that followed, Odessa moved through her grief with the support of her family. She stayed in the cabin, unable to imagine living anywhere else. This was the home Sullivan had built for them, and it was full of his presence. She could feel him in every log, every corner, every view from the windows. Samuel wanted her to come live with him and Emily, but Odessa refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "I am not leaving it. Your father and I built this life together, and I will honor it by staying where we were happiest." Her children understood. They visited often, making sure she had everything she needed. The grandchildren came too, bringing life and laughter back into the cabin that had grown so quiet. Odessa lived for another 7 years after Sullivan's death. They were good years, despite her grief. She spent them surrounded by family, teaching the new generation the skills she had learned and the values Sullivan had lived by. She told stories about their courtship, about the auction where he had bid $500, about the life they had built in these mountains. "He chose me first," she would tell her grandchildren, "when nobody else would, and he kept choosing me every day until the day he died." The great-grandchildren would climb into her lap and ask her to tell them again about the mountain man who had loved their great-grandmother so much. And Odessa would smile and tell the story one more time, keeping Sullivan's memory alive through her words. When Odessa was 73, she became ill. It was nothing dramatic, just a slow fading that the doctor said was her body getting ready to rest. She was not afraid. She had lived a full, beautiful life, and she was ready to see Sullivan again. On her last day, she was surrounded by her children and grandchildren in the cabin she had called home for nearly 50 years. The windows were open, letting in the scent of pine and wildflowers. She could hear birds singing and the wind moving through the trees. Clara held her hand and asked if there was anything she needed. "Just tell me about him," Odessa whispered. "Tell me about your father." So they did. Her children shared their favorite memories of Sullivan, his strength and his gentleness, his love of the mountains and his devotion to his family. The way he had loved their mother with every fiber of his being. "He chose you first, Mama," Samuel said, tears streaming down his face. "And he never stopped choosing you." Odessa smiled, her eyes drifting closed. "And I chose him back," she murmured. "First and last and always in between." Those were her last words. She passed away peacefully, slipping from one world to the next with the same quiet grace she had brought to everything in her life. They buried her beside Sullivan on the mountain, reuniting two people who had been meant for each other from the start. The entire family gathered for the funeral, 4 generations of people who existed because a mountain man had chosen a woman on an auction block, and she had chosen him back. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations. It became a place where the family gathered for reunions and celebrations, a living memorial to the love that had started it all. Above the fireplace, they hung a portrait of Sullivan and Odessa on their wedding day, young and full of hope, ready to build a life together. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the pines and the stars shone bright above the mountains, family members who stayed in the cabin swore they could feel the presence of 2 souls who had loved each other so deeply that not even death could separate them. The story of Sullivan and Odessa became family legend, passed down from parent to child and child to grandchild. It was a story about the power of being chosen, about the beauty of choosing someone back, about the kind of love that transforms lives and creates legacies. It was a story that started with a woman who had never been chosen first for anything and a mountain man who saw her and knew, who paid $500 not to own her but to love her, who built a life with her in the mountains and loved her every single day until death parted them. And it was a story that would live on forever in the hearts of those who descended from them. A reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest act of choosing someone when everyone else looks away, first and last and always in between. That was their promise. That was their legacy. That was their love, and it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.